Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode. And I'm absolutely thrilled today to have Kim Spencer with me for several reasons. First of all, she is now a fellow Texan. Number two, she's a fellow resident of the Hill Country. And number three, she is podcaster, evangelist extraordinaire. So I do not know how you can have three better qualities in one person, but we're going to explore all of that. So, Kim, with that incredibly long winded introduction, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
I'm so honored to be here with you, Tom. I love podcasting. I love hill country. I love being in Texas. Again, it's just such synergy. And that's the power of podcasting because we wouldn't have met had it not been for Podfest.
Exactly. So let's start with your professional background and your current role.
Yeah, my professional background has been incredibly varied, but the key through line of all of my career shifts from being a screenwriter in Hollywood to having my own brick and mortar Pilates studio to having an e-commerce store where we launched a product and took it to market to being a coach for the past 9 years, coaching high performing visionary leaders to now with our Communication Queens guest podcasting agency. The through line is storytelling. Like I have always been in the business of transforming people's stories. And why we started our agency was I saw the power and the profitability, quite frankly, with how podcasting can let be one of your greatest forms of lead and client generation, as it was for my coaching business and still is, and how podcasting also it allows for you to share your story in a way that then co-creates transformation in others. And that is the power of storytelling. So I've always been in the business of telling of transforming people's stories. It's just had several different iterations throughout my lifetime.
And I absolutely love that because this podcast is actually going to go on multiple podcasts. But one of them is going to have its audience as largely compliance officers. And one of the things I try to continually emphasize is number one, you have to tell stories to your customers. And number
Yeah.
two, in compliance, your customers are your employees, i.e., you got to tell a story. And so I love that through line of your professional career, seeing yourself as a storyteller in various iterations. And we're going to explore that a little bit more. But I have to ask you first, what brought you to the great state of Texas?
Well, my husband's a Texan, born and bred. He's from Houston. And I'm from California. And so we're part of the great Texodus, as I call it, the exodus out of California and escaping those taxes into Texas, which has a lot more freedom. We wanted to have land, we wanted to have our homestead, we wanted to have space for gardens. And quite frankly, you just can't get that for a reasonable price at in California. And we got back from Australia. We were stuck in Australia during COVID. I lost 3 family members and 2 family friends within the span of 1 year. Moved back to support my mom because it was her husband, my dad, and her mom and her sister. So my grandma and my aunt all passed away within that 1 year. And so we packed her up and we said, there's really nothing. She was like the last linchpin of being tied to California. And she had always said to my dad when he was alive, they moved to Texas. I'm coming with them. And so there really was no reason for her to stay. So we packed her up, and in 1 year, we manifested our dream house, and we made a list consciously as a family, my husband, my mom, and I, of everything we wanted in our dream house, in our dream property that would fulfill us, that would sustain us, that would allow us to grow with it. And we made that list, and then the universe delivered.
The one of the things that intrigued me about your story is you do not live in Houston, you do not live in Dallas, you do not live in Austin, you do not live in a large town, yet you've been able to build at least a nationwide practice and maybe an
Yeah.
international practice out of your small town. So that's one of the things I hope to explore. But I want to start with crown yourself. What is crown yourself and how does that really imbue everything you do?
So if you think about a queen, right? She's born with this idea that she's going to rule a nation. Like, how often do we look at a little baby and be like, you know what, you're the next leader of this country? Yet, so many have within us a divinely given potential of some purpose that we are put here on this planet to fulfill. And so the intention of crown yourself really comes from claiming your role and claiming your purpose as I believe to be divinely ordained. And like, this is who I'm supposed to be. This is how I like, not by anyone else's shoulds or supposed to be's, but by this is my divine sovereign mission. Just like any queen or king running a country, this is my sovereign mission to do this work in this world. And when a queen or a king is being raised, they're surrounding themselves with mentors, with guides, with support. No one who is putting in those little seeds of doubt in their mind. Like, I don't know. You shouldn't be queen. You're too little. You're only 6. But meanwhile, oh, you might want to have a realistic dream. That's the thing that I see so often, though, with most people is how often do we get those doubters who are like, oh, you want to be an astronaut? That's cute, but wait until you grow up. Like, you'll see how the world really works. And I'm like, is that the way the world really works? Or is that how we've been conditioned to believe that it works? And this is how I think with Crown Yourself, it really is about claiming the beliefs, the values, the mission that you have felt in your heart to go forth and create and put forth in the world. And you claim that as yours, and thus you put yourself in on the throne of ownership, which is not the sexiest position because it does come with a lot of responsibility, but it's better than having fear on your throne or the fear of what other people would say or the fear of the rejections. And so really it's claiming your own sovereignty in this lifetime to be able to say, this is who I am. This is what I'm here to create. And then setting forth and doing it.
Who is your primary customer base, Kim?
Visionary entrepreneurs, CEOs, and founders who are typically juggling 2 businesses. So they have one that's normally sustaining them, but then they have another one that maybe they inherited or they just bought. And then they're looking to jumble both, or they're navigating some form of major life transition, like they have a business or they have a solid career, but their parent passed away or they're going through a divorce. When they're in that state of transition and they know that there's something more for them on the other side of this challenging transformative time, that's typically when I step into play.
What is Ascension Acceleration?
So I love quantum leaps. Like I said, like we manifested our dream house within just the span of a few months once we actually got really clear on what it was we wanted. And the acceleration is what happens when you get really clear on and specific and courageous enough to start taking those courageous, bold actions to create that dream. And the ascension is the ascension to your throne. So the ascension into that seat of being the creator of your life, not reactionary to what other people, to the shoulds, to the fears that kind of can come with being in life, because we all have fears and doubts. Not being in that reactionary position, but kicking fear off your throne, really claiming what it is that you want and then going for it and taking those courageous, bold, specific moves. And so with uh, Ascension Acceleration, we help you get really clear, specific, courageous, and positively forward focused in what it is that you want to create in this world and in your lifetime. And then build an action plan to actually get you doing it.
The life lessons that you put into your coaching model. What I learned about 15 years ago, I always knew when the universe closed one door, it opened another. And
Mhm.
you've talked about that. But the lesson for me was you have to have the courage to walk through that door. And it took me a long time to learn that and to actually do that. Is that something you help people with, is to overcome that fear?
Yeah, yeah. One of the pillars in high performance is courage. Courage is directly tied to your energy, to your productivity, to your clarity. Because in doing action, when I see people who are in a stuck state, typically it's because they're not taking that bold, courageous action that they know they should do, but they're just not yet doing it. And so it's in courage that actually tips the scale on multiple levels into creating the reality that you desire. But it does take courage. It takes courage to, for me, I had to stage an intervention for my father and be willing to walk away from my family back in 2016 if he didn't get sober. And that took a lot of courage and it took me holding a boundary. But because he did, After 50 years of being an addict, I got to have the best 4 years with my dad until the end of his life. And it was one of his proudest accomplishments that he stayed sober off of alcohol for the last 4 years of his life. And I am so honored, but that took so much courage to have to do that. And it's those courageous next steps. It takes courage to start your own business. It takes courage to have that conversation with that employee who's underperforming. It takes courage to do anything that you want to create in this life. It takes courage to make that investment even though you don't feel ready. Like I just invested in an illustrator for a project that I've wanted to create for years now, which is a fart book. And because I have 2 boys and my oldest son, when he was born, was scared of his fart. And so I wrote a little poem book that I've always dreamed of having come to reality. And I was like, when I really sat with myself this year, I said, what courageous actions do I need to take? And I was like, I need to courageously create this fart book for children. Why? Because I can. And because it's already done. And so I hired an illustrator to go forth and create that project. It takes courage to create.
Let's turn to something that you and I think are both extraordinarily passionate about, but you've taken it really, I think, to a different level even than me, and that's podcasting.
Yeah.
And let's just start with, why do you espouse that podcasters are the historians of the future?
So if you look at content today, a lot of content is clickbait, right? Any social media content, the attention span is that of a gnat or a goldfish. It's 1.7 seconds and it's clickbait. It gets you hot and riled, but that's momentary. If we look at history, it observes and assesses the long term and it looks at effects and causes overall and is able, and then looks in through hindsight, we're able to assess. Well, you can base things off of trigger clickbait newsworthy headlines, but long form content where there is a longer form discussion, that's going to be looked back on by historians as far as what was the overall feel of the time. And because you get a more detailed, rich explanation as far as the circumstances of life, the economy, the people's mindsets, how they were thinking anthropologically. And so I truly believe that the podcasters will be the historians of the future because we're keeping a long form record. When you're stuck in that emotional reactionary state where you're getting trigger happy over every little clickbaity headline or news article, those keep those prevent us from actually diving deep into substance. And it allows us to stay on a surface level of emotion, of fear and of anger, which agitates, but not necessarily of seeing like where is all are all these little bits of triggers taking us. And I think through podcasting and through conversation and through dialogue and through relationship, that's how we're actually going to not only be the historians of the future, but actually create our future history, is because it's going to happen in relationship with one another.
So I have called myself the chronicler of compliance for about 15 years. I started blogging in 2010, and that led to podcasting in 2012. And I have certainly viewed myself as the a or the biggest repository of everything compliance, simply because I've been doing it for 15 years and I have every document and
Mhm.
every podcast on a hard drive somewhere or an iCloud somewhere. And at some point, if and when I ever retire, I was going to write that history. But I'm hearing from you something a little bit different, which is not simply a chronicler or an observer like a newspaper reporter might be, but as a part of that story. Did I get that part right?
Yeah, I think we're not only the historians, we are the story keepers and we're the story makers because we have relationship with everything around us. We have our relationship with our environment. We have a relationship with as communities. We have relationships with our families. We have relationships with money. And it's those who are evolving the conversation on the consciousness of these relationships that are not only record keeping of where our consciousness is in this time, but also simultaneously co-creating where our consciousness will be and is going based on conversation, based on relationship.
Well, then
I
If
think it's a
we're
pretty important job.
Yeah. If it's that important, but equally important, it feeds into that creative gene that all of us have. Why does every leader need a podcast? Why do they need to embrace the podcast format as opposed to other forms of communication, whether that be written, whether that be a speech or an interview process? Why do they need a, every leader need a podcast?
I think particularly like you see, especially as we come up on election season, there's all the clickbait headliner. This one little snippet was taken out of this one speech of this one thing that's this inflammatory thing that was said on either side, on any side. And it's when you can actually think about it. If you have a relationship with a friend and you have a differing belief, odds are you're probably going to say, okay, well, because you're still friends, can you tell me a little bit more about it? Like just out of curiosity rather than the instinctive, like reactionary emotional response because you have a relationship. And so for politicians, for leaders, for business leaders, when you are in relationship with your customers or in relationship with your even an internal podcast for your employees, that allows you to have your finger on the pulse of what's going on in the organization. And for politicians specifically, it allows you to have a larger platform to then share the nuances of your views versus where we people have this innate desire for purity of views. And if you don't agree on every single thing, then oh no, you're dead to me. Well, that sort of belief system. And so if you're able to expand and have a platform, and it doesn't have to be an ongoing forevermore podcast. It can be a simple here's the podcast 10 10-piece series on all talking about every single one of these issues that I think are really important to the country, that are really important to the organization, that are really important to our customers. And that allows you to set a standard of it's not this one clickbaity inflammatory thing. Here, have the whole perspective and then have discernment and trust that your audience is educated enough to listen. And what I love about podcasts is that most people listen like while they're in the car, while they're doing the dishes, while they're doing the laundry. So they're listening while doing something and it's in the background of their lives. So they're getting to hear more about a topic or a subject, giving more openness to even if they may disagree with one tiny specific aspect of it, they're able to say, okay, well, I hear your point and I hear your perspective because there's a deeper, intimate relationship that comes from the podcasting medium because someone's here, here,
They're actually in your head.
and in your head. They're right here, going straight in here.
Okay, I get that hosting or guesting on a pod can make you more human and humanize you in whatever role you have. But what I don't understand is how that process allows feedback to the host or to the guest, because you started off by saying it's a two-way communication.
Mhm.
How does the podcast facilitate a two-way communication?
So you can have a two-way communication by having people write in, maybe your employees, your customers, your constituents, write in asking you specific questions where you get to answer those or you answer several people's questions on the topic of a podcast. You can have it be where there is an interview-based podcast where it's open-ended Q&A. You can have it be where there is an interview with an expert or somebody that you're bringing on as somebody that you align with, that you support their values, and that allows for the relationship and the dialogue. You can have somebody that you bring on that you disagree with, and then that allows for a further relationship of dialogue of values. You can interview a competitor if you're in business and as a leader and interview a competitor and have a conversation about how you each do business differently. What is your unique value proposition in the marketplace?
Let me pick up on that last point because you said you can interview, but you also advocate being a guest. Why is being a guest, or how can that really work to expand your personal brand?
So if you think about it, there's 5.5 million podcasts out there currently on Apple, Spotify, and all the other platforms. And only about and 90% of those podcasts aren't producing 90% of those podcasts aren't they're not producing more than 10 episodes. They are not producing every 90 days. So if you just take that 500,000 group and then you chunk that down into a audience size that's specific to your niche. So let's say you have a business and you want to target entrepreneurship podcasts where, well, you've got about like at least 15,000 viable podcasts. Now, if you're starting your own podcast, a good solid download number to start with is like 50 downloads per episode. So if you have your own podcast, you release it weekly, you're getting about 200 downloads per month based on your own podcast. But if you guest on 4 different podcasts that are established top 5% podcasts that have produced 30 to 50 episodes, they produce every 90 days, they have at least 5 reviews, you may be getting in front of an audience of 600 people per episode. And now I'm someone who I grew up doing theater. And because I grew up doing theater, the setting of the stage and the production is not the hardest part. It's challenging, don't get me wrong. There is something in theater called Hell Week where you're doing the rehearsals until however long you are until the show opens. But the harder part is getting the audience there. And the easiest one is if you do it for a school because you have a built-in audience of parents. But if you're doing theater like I did back when I was 17, 18 years old in Hollywood, and you have a black box theater where there's 20 people and your parents and friends have already seen the show 4 times, then eventually I've done shows where there are like literally 2 people in the audience. And there's a rule in theater where you still perform it at the level, whether it's 2, whether it's 200 or 2,000, it doesn't matter. You still perform the show, but the hardest part is getting the audience there. And by guesting on other people's podcasts, you are borrowing their audience. And that alone is so valuable. So that's why the 7th step in our communication queen process is it is starting your own podcast, but it's step number 7. Step number 1 through 6 is all about how to guest and stand out as a guest and then attract people as you borrow other people's audiences. You then build your own audience. And by building your own audience, so then when you build the show, it's already built in and baked in. You've done the hardest part first and you've reverse engineered it.
So why is a mindset, or what it perhaps is the mindset required for visibility for a leader?
Oh, this is such a great question, Tom, because I was surprised when I started my agency because we were targeting high level, high 6-figure, 7-figure business owners, some 8-figure business owners who I was shocked that at the feedback that we've received from like the power of just going on multiple shows and sharing your story and serving with your tips and tricks and strategies because I didn't think the coaching aspect that I've been a coach for 9 years as a high performance leadership coach. I didn't think that was going to come into play. It totally did. Because if you think about people's greatest fear, they fear public speaking more than death. Fortunately, podcasting, because it's an intimate medium, it doesn't give the perception initially that it's public speaking, but you're still putting yourself out there. And in putting yourself out, there is the fear of rejection. There is the fear of the haters. And there is the fear that as you get bigger, yes, that percentage of haters is going to get larger as well. Not necessarily larger in terms of the ratio. Typically, it stays about maybe 5%, maybe 10%. I've never heard it going more than that unless you're a particularly inflammatory human being. But for the most part, if you're spreading a message of here's my story, here's my transformation, here's what's possible for you, here's some strategies to support you in growing in your health, your wealth, your relationships, most people are pretty receptive to that. You will get a percentage of people that are like, no, this is not right. Here's all the reasons as to why this isn't true. Here's all the reasons, etc. But the percentage ratio is typically only about 10%. However, when you're expanding your visibility, suddenly, even if you had a small amount of visibility, let's say you had 100 people and you had 10% of that, never do math in public. This is not my strong suit. But if you had 10% of that, which is 10 people who were like, oh, no, I don't like your message. I don't like who you are. When you expand that to 100,000, then 1,000 people not liking your work is it can feel very intense. However, do not neglect the other 90,000 people who you're impacting in a positive way. So it requires a mindset of holding a paradox that, yes, as you expand your visibility, the critics, the haters, the people who don't like your work, they will expand too. And that's okay, because I like to think of it like you get to be the person who's like unlocking a safe. And I see any hater or critic or person who rejects my work as someone who I activated something within them, and probably something that they need to work on or explore on their own. And because of that activation, they created a reaction that then created them to say something nasty on my Instagram. It doesn't really happen that often. But that being said, because of that, when you have that experience, then I see, okay, that activated something. It's like turning the knob on a safe. So eventually they're going to get to a breakthrough where they're going to have some breakthrough where they're like, oh my gosh, if I take ownership for my life and stop telling myself this victim story, then suddenly I actually get to create a new reality. That's okay with me. If I get to be like a turn of the dial that eventually unlocks that belief system for them so that they can feel empowered and inspired, then great. Awesome. I've done my part, but it's not a comfortable part because they do project their insecurities onto me. And that's okay, because I've allowed that, like, me being able to speak, me being able to have that visibility, it presented them with an activation inside of them that they get to go forth and either do the inner work, or maybe they get to carry that around a bit more. I don't know. I don't know their journey, but I do know that it for the leaders, it takes a mindset of focusing on the 90% that you are impacting, focusing on serving them as best you can. And as my grandpa said, there's 10% of people that just generally will never like what you do. They'll never really support what you do. They don't really get what you do, and they don't care. And that's okay. But don't neglect the 90%. That's it. You got it. It's not hard math. Do you only put the focus on the 10% that don't like you, that could reject you? Or do you focus on the 90% that really are like hungry for you to serve them? And that's the mindset that you have to focus on, because our fear-based brains will want to be driven to the negative because we'll want to protect ourselves from that, versus looking toward the positive of the 90% that we can focus on. And in focusing on that, we're able to serve at such a higher level and expand our service to grow that 90% to from it being just 100 people to it being 100,000 people.
Let me ask you to turn your head down the road to mid-century,
Ooh.
2030 and beyond. Where do you see the continued evolution of podcasting down that path?
Ooh. I think we're in for a very interesting next 7 years, particularly 2030 and beyond. I am part of a high level tech mastermind. And basically, what I've heard is if you can keep yourself alive for the next 7 years, we'll all be living till 120. So I think if podcasting can help people sustain that, and I think podcasting, by going forth and sharing your story, I do believe that can create healing within yourself, because it creates greater integration. It also allows you to hear yourself sharing your own story. And in doing that, sometimes you can hear, wow, I repeated that story a lot. And it's like no longer has its power. Like it no longer holds its power over me. So I think that podcasting and guest podcasting that in and of itself can create a healing medium for people to kind of heal their own unserving stories that are holding them back from their highest potential. I see podcasting as as an industry on an exponential curve, because it exploded during COVID. I see that it's going to explode even more as more people come online in the next 2 years specifically. I think that bilingual podcast is going to be huge, especially because the Latin countries are coming on board in droves for podcasting, and they're hungry for that information. And it's a huge demographic. I think that we are going to see the evolution of politicians starting to get their own podcasts in order to, before they go for bigger roles in politics and in public service, because that's going to allow for them to have and build a platform. And I think we're going to see the evolution of people really understanding that your personal brand and your reputation, we are in a reputation economy. And that means so much that to people, and especially as we think of the the next generation that's coming into listenership of podcasting, they're not just all dancing on TikTok. They're actually very clear and specific about what it is that they want. They are very driven in many ways by a level of excellence in the products that they want to be served with. And I think that it's going to allow for us as podcasters to raise our standards for audio quality, for video quality, for listenership, and for delivery at, of the show in order to be really serving of the next generation.
Kim, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted any more information on yourself or to get in contact with you, what would be the best place for them to go or way for them to do so?
Yeah, if you love this episode and you want to hear more and you're interested in conscious leadership principles and tips to expand your reign, then head on over to crownyourself.com/podcast and listen to the Crown Yourself podcast. And if you're interested in how to leverage podcasting for your business growth to grow your business, your brand awareness, and your bottom line, then head on over to communicationqueens.com/podcast and subscribe to the Communication Queen podcast.
Kim, thanks again. I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Same here, Tom. Thank you so much.